So we're here to talk through this cave puzzle I wrote called Mirror Cave, and the theme is based off of vertical line of symmetry through center of the grid, and 8 is a mirror of itself, and a digit 5 is a mirror of the digit 2 if you think about an LED calculator type display. And so while this font doesn't preserve the theme perfectly, the sense that all the clues, not just where they sit, but literally their numbers, their values, would be mirror images on an LED calculator as you flipped across that. That was the idea of the theme. For the logical solve, it drives like a lot of these with a 2 off a diagonal 8, and those will always have to have the cells opposite the 2 outside of the cave. That's because of a constraint we'll often call the checkerboard pattern, but if we actually had, for instance, a cell above the 2 coming in, you'd be making a checkerboard here, where for this to get to the outside of the grid and for this to get to the outside of the grid, you'd be isolating the cave from itself. So there's a rationale for why we always have to avoid forming an on-off pattern or a checkerboard pattern with this kind of alternating space. And what that means is one of these 2 cells near this number must be filled in. One of these cells near this number must be filled in. The direct consequence is these cells on the opposite side of the 2 are outside the cave. And again, to avoid another checkerboard issue, we have to actually fill this. So I shade this in quite quickly because it's heuristic I've learned hundreds of cave puzzles ago. But if you still don't get it, we were trying at least at the start to kind of mark in why these are the case. In this puzzle, it puts quick progress because it's marked off spots where this 5 could go. Comes in here, finishes off the 2. Another thing that's going to be useful as we make progress, I'm going to start to make a notation style. We're going to mark cells that can't get used across edges. So one of these cells must be outside the cave is what this kind of notation means. Because if I came down here and took the cell in the cave, then this for sure is outside the cave. And if not, then this is already outside the cave. So this is a kind of notation to say that one of those will be outside the cave, and it will be somewhat helpful as we keep making progress to use these notations. In this case, 8 is near to 2, so these don't connect. There looks to be some interesting things in this lower right corner. This 2 can come to the left or can come up, but if I mark in, as I did before, this kind of meaning of these edges, one thing you'll see is that you can't get out of this corner unless you use this cell. So regardless of which direction the 2 goes, the cell is always inside the cave. Actually, in this case, it completes the 2 in doing so, and avoiding checkerboards puts these in. This 2 has to keep coming over to the left now. We want to get around this clue and still have one connected cave. If I took this cell, that would isolate immediately. So instead, I come to the top. That finishes this 2. These keep coming across. This 2 is isolated, has to come up and over. That finishes the 5. This 2 has to come up. That finishes here. This 8 can come up as many as 2 cells, but then takes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That finishes here, and we'll have to take those cells. Now, there's a hard deduction in cave puzzles until you get pretty familiar with the checkerboard rule we were talking about at the start, and it comes visually for me when I see something like one of my notations of one of these cells is outside the cave, near in one side or the other, a place where I already have the outside inside cave marked. And notice that we actually functionally, like the edge is already in the grid, but there's functionally this pattern. And so anytime you've got 2 X's that would be in the same spaces, you've got tension, and the tension is exactly for this reason. If I have this inside the cave, that's outside the cave, and I form a deadly checkerboard. And so on the side of these patterns where you've got an X near an off on, the cell that must absolutely be outside the cave is this one. You don't know anything about the other cell, but on the same pattern as a cell that's outside the cave, this one must be outside the cave, because again, otherwise you're going to form a checkerboard. So this being out means this 2 comes over here. We shade in this cell, which has to get to an edge. That means we shade in this cell for the 5 and avoid this checkerboard. This space, actually now this 8 doesn't have a lot for it. It can take 4 over to the left. This would be 5, this would be 6, this would be 7, this would be 8. That now blocks off this shaded set that has to come up. This 8 also has that constraint where it only takes so many in this row. It can take as many as 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, come down to here. This has a total of 7 around it already, so this would be 8, 9 if it took this cell, so it can't take that cell, so it takes this cell. That's now a valid set of 8. This is a valid set of 8. Got this marked in. This 5 can take 2 above it. That's a total of 3, 4, 5. We're now in a case where we can only get one more cell in either direction from these clues. We have this long 8 that needs to get 2 more, but I can only take 1 up above. And in marking that in, we know it will take this. That now means this 5, which has 4 cells filled, can't take more than 1 in that direction or 1 in that direction. And here we're running into our logical friend for this puzzle again, like we had over here. We've got an off-on pattern that's now adjacent to 2 cells that have an X in my notation style. What that means is we can't take the cell, because if this is inside the cave, we form a checkerboard in what it does. So on the same side as the cell that's outside the cave, you must have another cell that's outside the cave. And in marking that in, we now will see that we have a checkerboard down below. So this gets marked in. We now have this 5 coming down, forming a checkerboard potential pattern. If this were inside the cave, that's outside the cave. So actually, if you look at these 2 cells, this one here has to also be outside. So sort of this chain into that chain is the same rule again, but all these are outside to avoid checkerboard pattern. The 5 then has to take this cell instead. That comes up here. Avoid this checkerboard, avoid this checkerboard. The 5 is actually completed. This shaded cell has to get out to the exterior of the grid, and we actually have to use this cell to get these all the exterior of the grid. This 2 is complete, so we've got these marked in. This 5 in the corner has to take at least 2 cells to the right to get all the way up to 5. This has options for it still. This here, 1, 2, 3, 4, has to take this cell. So now we've got a case where we have this clue, one of these at least is outside the grid, and it's going to need to connect to the outside edge of the whole puzzle. So this will have to be unused for that to be true. That means this 5 comes up here. You can take over the cell. This clue needs to take this. Now this 5 can only take this cell to get up to 5. That marks this in. We've got a total of 8 cells already around that 8 clue, so everything else is outside the cave, and we finished the grid. So hopefully a little bit through this description was teaching you that basic heuristic of no checkerboards, but then also the power of this notation of marking edges where we know we can't extend, particularly where those edges are near an outside-inside pattern. So here, and then on the left side of the grid around here, were a few instances of how this pattern quickly gave external cells from the cave that forced the rest of the logic. So hopefully you enjoyed the visual theme of the puzzle and also the logical solving of the puzzle, and we'll see you again soon.